Another reset has gone by, so it's time to look again at what happened last reset. This is now the third reset of the season since the opening of both the Mythic raid as well as Mythic Plus. So we're starting first, as we did last week, with the situation in the raid. We haven't looked at this in a full week. Last week we also had some balance tuning that changed some specs, the major one being the hotfix nerf to Preservation Evoker before the beginning of this week, where Preservation Evoker got another nerf. However, since last week, what we see right now are the current results in terms of DPS in Nerub'ar Palace Mythic difficulty. Now, what is interesting here, of course, is that we are also going to check not just these results, which are, as usual, the results for all damage types, all damage profiles combined in one, together with the results of the damage done to bosses, to have a clearer idea of also the single target damage, not just the overall damage done to bosses. What is also interesting, of course, is to then compare this with what we are getting this reset. As we have seen in the last few days, we have the nerf to Beast Mastery Hunter's single target damage. So in this current week, we will be able to see how much will this nerf affect the performance of Beast Mastery in the raid, for example. Obviously, we have a few other changes, like the slight buff given to Shadow Priest, for example. You also have the nerfs again given to Preservation Evoker, the buffs given to Restoration Druid that will hit this week. So we can also use this as a benchmark for this upcoming week to see how many of these changes will be affecting the specs in the raid. Now, some of these, at this point, after the third week of the season, you have gotten familiar with, like the performance of the mages, enhancement and elemental shaman, 2 of the DK specs, Havoc Demon Hunter, Ret Paladin. Those have been around this area for quite a while, and you can say the same pretty much for the opposite, seeing specs like Shadow Priest, like Demo, like Balanced Druid towards the bottom. These are also not particularly new visions in these results. Now, as usual, it can depend boss by boss, it can depend on certain damage profile. If we switch from looking at all of the bosses to looking at something like Sikran, which is a pure single target boss, of course you start seeing certain specs that weren't at the top overall, like Beast Mastery Hunter, for example, or Devastation Evoker getting to be much higher. If we go back to instead the damage to all bosses, then they just drop down, much further down. The perhaps news of today is that after a week, it means you now have more logs, you now have more results to be able to give you a better idea of how specs have been doing on Ovinax. You know, last time we had barely 20 logs per spec, now we are getting into the hundreds, so it's getting clearer about the results of the specs. And to not surprise, of course, Broad Twister being a fight that has a reasonable amount of adds, a lot of add damage, you do see both of the DK specs, but also Fury, Havoc, Demon Hunter doing much better. That's because, of course, when we move over to Broad Twister, a lot of the damage done in here by many of these specs, like Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior is not traditionally a spec we have mentioned seeing towards the top in terms of overall damage. They are in fact towards the bottom. But when you move to Broad Twister, you see the 2 Fury Warriors topping the meters. Then you look, of course, at the damage done to Broad Twister himself, and the damage of the warriors is mediocre to below average. That's because, of course, the warriors are busy doing tons of damage to the blood parasites rather than the boss himself. That's why they have a good performance on this boss, mostly due to their AoE damage. What is also interesting is that in this week we have started to also get logs of Nexus Princess. Nexus Princess is the opposite of Broad Twister, because Nexus Princess is instead completely single target. So it will be much less likely, of course, to see a Fury Warrior do well, since we have already gotten the idea that their single target is not too well performing right now. And we do have somewhat of a rerun, somewhat of a duplicate of Sikran, where Sikran was a single target fight. So for example, Beast Mastery Hunter went back in being good. You go back to a single target fight in Nexus Princess and Beast Mastery Hunter is up, doing well again. That is the nature of checking the results during early progression. You will have these logs, becoming higher and higher as we go by the weeks. For example, right now, the results of Frost and Fire Mage. If you were to say, oh wow, Frost Mage is so much better than Fire Mage. No. it's one guy playing Frost and one guy playing Fire, so it doesn't really mean much. You can get more clear ideas, for example, in the Power of Arcane or BM, like for example, they both do well because you already have into the hundreds of logs, but not for some of these specs that are not really being popular. We have already mentioned this when it comes to Fire, actually, in the overall results, in the fact that Fire is not really played a lot. They have though increased, because last time we checked this, Fire was much lower down in terms of overall performance. Now they are about to pass Frost Mage, and I'm going to go out on a limb and bet some $3 that by the time we check this next week, Fire Mage will have comfortably passed Frost Mage in terms of popularity, likely due to many players going in here and seeing Frost over here and Fire Mage over here and wondering what's going on and trying out more Fire Mage. So this is the current situation when it comes to the DPS. What of course we are also interested in is then this week trying to predict what these changes, these extra added changes in the reset, are going to do to many of the specs. We have mentioned some of the outliers like BM being nerfed, like Shadow Priest being buffed, like the massive nerf to Preservation Evoker, but also there's a few other things like Survival being buffed, Frostfire being buffed, although it won't really matter much for single target. This is more of a Mythic Plus thing. You also have Red Paladin having Templar buffed, as well as Outlaw, the other biggest one of the buffed specs. So some of these might have a significant change this week in performance. Perhaps Outlaw with their buff could go up in this realm of damage. Same goes for Shadow Priest, a bit higher up. We will see just how much this will be impacted, if it can, move some of the results in the made up tier lists of the performance of the specs in the raid. At this point we have gotten these for quite a while. Some of the specs being buffed were quite low down, like Outlaw, like Shadow Priest. So we will see if this will improve their performance, or rather improve their popularity and the perception of the specs in the raid compared to where they are sitting now. Many of these specs not doing particularly well. Of course, when we talk about these performance changes, we can also look at the one of the healers, because as usual, as we have been mentioning recently, the biggest spotlight when it came to massive changes and big performance results was in healers at the beginning of this season, particularly with Preservation Evoker. So they had the largest nerf by far out of any spec, and now we will see this week how much will this impact them. It's funny because according to data and according to research, this actually won't really change too much, so you don't get to expect this to just suddenly drop here, because the top build of Preservation, Flameshaper, will simply move to be Chrono Warden. And because Chrono Warden is still very powerful, it is likely that even with this big nerf given to Flameshaper, rather than dropping from here to here, they will simply drop from here to here, which is still a big drop, a big jump, but they will still be towards the top of the results. Obviously, if you were to go now and look at all bosses and the healing results, the majority, of course, of the colors you will see are the ones of Preservation Evoker. But, for example, if we were to look at the results of Evoker starting from today, and today only, obviously it depends a bit on the server, which servers already got their resets and which didn't, but you can see that already the Chrono Warden amount of evokers is starting to increase, because that's when there is going to be the change, the takeover from Flameshaper to Chrono Warden for the majority of the evokers. So we will see exactly how much this will be impacted on Evoker as well as Restoration Druid. At the moment, Restoration Druid is on the bottom half of the popularity of specs, and now they have received another flat aura buff by 5%. So again, this should bring them even higher than they already are, because when you look at the results, the good results of the healers, they are still very, very close. Yes, they are technically speaking last, but if you add a 5% buff to this result, to 1.26 million, 5% is about 65,000, 63,000, so they would go at 1.32. 1.32 would put them here. That's what the 5% buff would do to Resto Druid. So that is an interesting situation with Ursa Druid continuing to be buffed over and over in the past 3 weeks, and now we will likely see them actually become now one of the better specs in this, I guess, in this, you know, later part of progression, 3 weeks in, beginning the 4th week. This buff will definitely make Ursa Druid not a completely useless spec as many thought they were at the beginning of the tier. Yeah. Who knew if you continue to buff a spec by 5% and 6% and then 5% again, eventually their numbers will be good enough to be a competitive spec. And since we are talking about the raid, rather than just spending time to touch on the performance of both the healers and the DPS, we also have to spend a second to mention the current situation when it comes to progression. Yes, the race to world first is over, but this was only mattering for about, 100 or so players. The remaining several dozens of hundreds of thousands are still doing their thing in the raid, right? Now, the interesting thing about this raid is that so far it is approaching to have pseudo Amirdrassil level of progression, despite not many players having nearly enough the same amount of complaints for the difficulty of this tier. For example, we are now 3 weeks basically since the beginning of Mythic. And on top of that, this season we also had the help of having normal and heroic open for 1 week for you to start stocking up on gear before Mythic actually opened. So Smolderon, for example, 20 days after the release of the raid on the 14th of November, so 20 days since then is practically the 3rd, the 4th of December, right? So if you go to the first kills of Smolderon around the 3rd to 4th of December, you would be around, rank 150, right? So Smolderon was the 3rd last of the bosses and considered the last of the 3 difficult ones. So if we translate that boss to this tier, obviously this would be Nexus Princess, right? You have Nexus Princess into Silken Court into Queen Ansurek. And at the moment, in the same timeline, in the same span of time from this tier compared to Amirdrassil, the amount of kills of Nexus Princess are 94. Smolderon are 155. Nexus Princess is proving to be considerably harder in terms of progression compared to Smolderon, and Smolderon already was considered quite a tough boss. Yes, Smolderon was nerfed faster and harder than Nexus Princess was. Nexus Princess was nerfed basically during progression of the first guilds that were trying to do Nexus Princess, and after that she's been left practically alone. So actually Nexus Princess is harder at the moment than, I guess, pre-multiple nerfs Smolderon. Things are not, nearly as lopsided in favor of this raid when we get into Tindral, because Tindral practically in the first 20 or so days they had at best 16 kills of Tindral. So if we compare the 16 kills of Tindral with the kills of Silken Court, you are at 24. So we have 24 guilds killing Silken Court, 17 killing Tindral. So Tindral is proving to be harder, but not by much, not by the same gap that we have seen between Nexus Princess and Smolderon. And then you have, of course, the last boss being Farak compared with Ansurek. In the first 20 or so days, we have gotten 7 kills of Ansurek. We can give for granted today's kill probably of Fatshark, yes, the 8th kill about 20 days in. Then you compare this instead of Tindral with Farak, 20 days in, roughly 3rd to 4th of December. Well, that's 5 kills. So we have now about almost 7 for now kills of Ansurek versus the 5 kills of Farak. So it is proceeding at a similar slow rate of Amirdrassil. If we were to compare, for example, rather than using Amirdrassil, which is the last tier of the expansion, with Vault of the Incarnates, because first tier, sort of an equal comparison, and instead compare this with Razageth. Razageth did also have similar numbers, because Razageth had, again, 20 or so days into the tier, it had about 7 to 8 kills. But Razageth ran through Christmas holidays. So it is a worthwhile excuse, perhaps, in terms of the amount of kills that it had, in terms of progression, but even then it's slightly above the current kills of Queen Ansurek. So not just talking about the performance currently of the specs in the raid, but also about the difficulty of the raid. This has proven to be a pretty reasonably tough first tier for the expansion, especially perhaps, and here is where we can complain or criticize the release of the tier, the stark difference in difficulty between the first half of the tier and the second half of the tier. We are in a situation where this was happening already in this last reset, so third reset of the season, in a situation where guilds were progressing, maybe Ovinax or Nexus Princess, while pugs were able to kill the first three rather consistently and even try the fourth one. This is not something too common. You didn't see, certainly, 3 weeks into the season, 3 weeks into release of Dragonflight, pugs casually pugging Taros or Sennart, for example. Whereas this is something that we have been seeing right now in the release of this tier. Despite being a harder tier, we can say practically all of it is backloaded in the bottom 4, which I have also the ones that have been nerfed now multiple weeks in a row: Broad Twister, Nexus Princess, Silken Court, and Ansurek. So while it is being difficult, perhaps some of the complaints could be on the spread of difficulty, which seems to practically only be relegated to the bottom 4 bosses, and the first 4 being far too simple in terms of difficulty. However, even within that difficulty, these were the performances of the specs in this latest week that just ended. We haven't gotten too many changes in terms of specs in this latest week, but we have gotten them now. As mentioned, we've gotten a series of changes to the balance tuning, both in the form of buffs as well as in the form of nerfs. So we will see next week how these will have affected specs, not just in the raid, of course, but we will also see how much they will be affecting the specs in Mythic Plus. Some of these are more relevant for Mythic Plus, like the AoE damage buffs to Beast Mastery, the AoE damage buff to Subtlety Rogue, the changes also to Frostfire, on whether or not more mages will start switching over to playing Frostfire, as well as the buffs to Lightsmith for both Holy and Prot Paladin and Templar for Ret Paladin. But for today, since this was focused on the raid, that's all we have to point out on this Wednesday. So for today, on this new reset of the season, we are now leaving each other. We're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking everyone who has watched the video and also everyone who is supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I thought I had more time. I have less than an hour before I have to get busy, and I'm a bit disappointed, to be honest.